Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And this is illustrated by Michael Foreman. Look at all these chapters here. All right, here's chapter 1. Here comes Charlie, page 11. Okay, chapter 1. Here comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. Look at these people. They look like they're from the Revolutionary War period in the United States, like 1700s. Where is this? Where is this book set? And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. Look at Grandpa George. This is Mr. Bucket, right here. This is Mrs. Bucket. They look like nice parents, don't they? Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. Look at, he wears a cap. I think this is England, isn't it? I think the original story is set in England. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. Charlie Bucket. And look at their house. Look at this. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, count them. That's 2 grandparents, another 2 grandparents, and mom and dad, right? And little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. Do you see the town in the background there? Look at that. And here's the house. Man, look at that house. They have 2 chimneys? Oh, maybe one for cooking, right? And one for the fireplace. Boy, that looks like an old house, doesn't it? And look, do they collect rainwater here for drinking, maybe? Or for gardening, maybe? Man, the whole family lives there, 7 people. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only one bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. They never got out of bed. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold draughts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. What's drought mean? This word drought. Do you know that word? It means a dry time, a dry period. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. So poor. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. He worked at a toothpaste factory screwing lids on toothpaste bottles. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. They didn't have enough food. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a little better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Wow, they were always hungry. Charlie felt it worst of all. And although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't enough for a growing boy. That's sad, isn't it? He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. I tried to turn on that light again. It went off. He longed for chocolate. Look at this. It says chocolate in big letters right here, see? Chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows. And he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching them greedily. And that, of course, was pure torture, because he wanted chocolate too. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when that great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat, all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned, and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. He really loved his chocolate, huh? And for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then, at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble. And look at these words here in italics. Tiny nibble. Just enough to allow the sweet, lovely taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on, and so on. And in this way Charlie would make his chocolate, his sixpenny bar of birthday chocolate, last him for more than a month. What does sixpenny mean? I think that means it costs 6 pennies, I guess. I don't know. This is British English, isn't it? So I don't know what that means. I think it means it costs 6 pennies. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing, for him, was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this, right here. In the town itself, actually within sight of his house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory. Right here, Wonka's factory. Willy Wonka, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading to it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys. Smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside of it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with a heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Oh my goodness. I'm getting hungry. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. So today we're going to learn about the factory, Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say good night. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. for they loved this little boy. He was the only thing that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all four of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other three old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as it can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above! I don't know what's the matter with me." "Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak. And throughout the day, he spoke very little. There's Grandpa Joe right there, talking to Charlie. And there's the other two grandparents, and there's Grandpa Joe's wife. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" See the spelling here of the word center? That's a British spelling. American spelling is C-E-N-T-E-R. "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine, "and he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is, and to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he has invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Of course it's impossible," cried Grandpa Joe. "It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it." "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their heads. "Mr. Wonka has done it." And then again, Grandpa Joe went on speaking very slowly now, so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets, and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely blue birds' eggs with black spots on them, and when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue." That sounds kind of gross. You put an egg in your mouth, and then like a chocolate egg or something, and then a bird comes out. Hope you don't eat it. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. "It makes my mouth water just thinking about it," he said. "Mine too," said Charlie. "But please go on." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door, listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear that." "You mean Prince Pottencherry?" said Grandpa Joe. He began chuckling with laughter. "Completely dotty," said Grandpa George. "But very rich," said Grandma Georgina. "What did he do?" asked Charlie eagerly. "Listen," said Grandpa Joe, "and I'll tell you." Nice. This is called Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pottencherry wrote a letter to Mr. Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed, and what a palace it was. It had 100 rooms, and everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures and the furniture and the beds. And when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. Can you imagine? Turn on your faucet in your bathroom and chocolate comes out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pottencherry, "I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away." "Nonsense!" cried the prince. "I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it." But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly to the ground. This is the palace made out of chocolate. And the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. "Is all this really true?" he asked, "or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true!" cried all four of the old people at once. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like." "And I'll tell you something else that's true," said Grandpa Joe, and now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever comes out." Nobody ever comes out of Mr. Wonka's factory? "Out of where?" said Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "Wonka's factory, of course." "Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie." "Workers?" "All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and the evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place, or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa," Charlie stammered. "Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed." "Exactly," said Grandpa Joe. "But there must be people working there." "Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway." "Then who?" cried Charlie. "Aha! That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's cleverness." "Charlie, dear," Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear." "Tomorrow, my darling." "That's right," said Grandpa Joe. "I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening. Shall we go on a little bit? The secret workers? What do you think? Let's read about the secret workers. Chapter 4, The Secret Workers. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie," he said, "not so very long ago there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, never to come back." "But why?" asked Charlie. "Because of spies." "Spies?" "Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made." "And did they go back to their own factories and tell?" asked Charlie. "They must have," answered Grandpa Joe, "because soon after that, Fickle Grubber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavor, however much you chewed it." Excuse me. "And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, 'This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere! I shall have to close the factory!'" "But he didn't do that?" Charlie said. "Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain, and suddenly Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimneys stopped smoking, the machines stopped whirring, and from then on, not a single chocolate or sweet was made. Not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely." "Months and months went by," Grandpa Joe went on, "but still the factory remained closed. And everybody said, 'Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice, and he made such marvelous things, but he's finished now, it's all over.' Then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen to be coming out of the tops of the tall chimneys on the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. 'What's going on?' they cried. 'Someone lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again.' They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open, and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no, the great iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. 'But the factory is working!' the people shouted. 'Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air.' Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long bony finger on Charlie's knee, and he said softly, 'But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the streets outside could see small dark shadows moving about behind the frosted glass windows.' 'Shadows of whom?' said Charlie quickly. That's exactly what everyone wanted to know. 'The place is full of workers,' the people shouted, 'but nobody's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either.' But there was no question at all, said Grandpa Joe, that the factory was running. And it's gone on running ever since, for these last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and sweets it's been turning out have become more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now, when Mr. Wonka invents some new and wonderful sweet, neither Mr. Fickergrubber, nor Mr. Prodnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody else is able to copy it. No spies can go into the factory to find out how it is made. But Grandpa, who, cried Charlie, who is Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory? Nobody knows, Charlie. But that's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka? Nobody sees him anymore. He never comes out. The only things that come out of that place are chocolates and sweets. They come out through a special trap door in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they are picked up every day by post office trucks. But Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there? My dear boy, said Grandpa Joe, that is one of the greatest mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We know only one thing about them. They are very small. The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when the lights are on, are those of tiny people, people no taller than my knee. There aren't any such people, Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. Have you heard the news? He cried. He held up the paper so that they could see the huge headline. The headline said, Wonka Factory to be opened at last to lucky few. Ooh, they're going to open up the factory to some people. And the next chapter is The Golden Ticket. Chapter 5 is called The Golden Tickets. You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory? Cried Grandpa Joe. Read us what it says, quickly. All right, says Mr. Bucket, smoothing out the newspaper. Listen. This is what the newspaper said. Evening Bulletin. Mr. Willy Wonka, the confectionery genius, whom nobody has seen for the last 10 years, sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and the magic of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets. 5 golden tickets have been printed on golden paper, and these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary chocolate bars. These 5 chocolate bars may be anywhere, in any shop, in any street, in any town, in any country in the world, upon any counter where Wonka's sweets are sold, and the 5 lucky finders of these 5 golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed to visit my factory and see what it's like now inside. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting. Signed, Willy Wonka. Isn't that amazing? How would you feel if you found a golden ticket to Mr. Wonka's factory? The man's dotty, muttered Grandma Josephine. He's brilliant, cried Grandpa Joe. He's a magician. Just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying Wonka's chocolate bars in the hope of finding one. He'll sell more than ever before. Oh, how exciting it would be to find one. And all the chocolate and sweets that you could eat for the rest of your life free, said Grandpa George. Just imagine that. They'd have to deliver them in a truck, said Grandma Georgina. It makes me quite ill to think of it, said Grandma Josephine. Nonsense, cried Grandpa Joe. Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open up a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket glistening inside? It certainly would, Grandpa, but there isn't a hope, Charlie said sadly. I only get 1 bar a year. You never know, darling, said Grandma Georgina. It's your birthday next week. You have as much chance as anybody else. I'm afraid that simply isn't true, said Grandpa George. The kids who are going to find the golden tickets are the ones who can afford to buy chocolate bars every day. Our Charlie only gets 1 a year. There isn't any hope. What do you think? You think Charlie has any hope at all? What do you think? He's in a poor family on the edge of town. He gets 1 chocolate bar every year. Let's see. Well, the next chapter is chapter 6. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat, he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. This is Augustus Gloop. And I don't know if you've seen the movie, the 1971 movie with Gene Wilder, but I really like the character in that movie. I don't know about the Johnny Depp movie, the newest one, but I really like that 1971 movie. He's so funny. Have you seen that one? Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough with 2 small, greedy, curranty eyes peering out upon the world. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over the hero. Flags were flying from all the windows. Children had been given a holiday from school, and a parade was being organized in honor of the famous youth. I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket, his mother had told the newspapers. He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one. Eating is his hobby, you know. That's all he's interested. But still, that's better than being a hooligan and shooting off zip guns and things like that in his spare time, isn't it? And what I always say is he wouldn't go on eating like this unless he needed nourishment, would he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill it will be for him just to visit Mr. Wonka's marvelous factory. We're just as proud as anything. Do you think chocolate bars are all vitamins? Look at this. It says here, chocolate bars are all vitamins, it says. I don't know about that. What a revolting woman, said Grandma Josephine. And what a repulsive boy, said Grandma Georgina. Only 4 golden tickets left, said Grandpa George. I wonder who'll get those. And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad chocolate buying spree. Everyone searching frantically for those precious remaining tickets. Fully grown women were seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka bars at a time, then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of £1,000. What's pounds? It's English money, isn't it? English currency. And spent the whole lot on Wonka bars that same afternoon. And a pound is more than an American dollar, isn't it? So £1,000 is a lot of money. And he spent it all on chocolate bars. And when the police entered his house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of chocolate, ripping off the wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. In far-off Russia, a woman called Charlotte Roos claimed to have found the second ticket, but it turned out to be a clever fake. The famous English scientist, Professor Foulbody, invented a machine which would tell you at once, without opening the wrapper of a bar of chocolate, whether or not there was a golden ticket hidden underneath it. The machine had a mechanical arm that shot out with tremendous force and grabbed hold of anything that had the slightest bit of gold inside of it. And for a moment, it looked like the answer to everything. But unfortunately, while the professor was showing off the machine to the public at the sweet counter of a large department store, the mechanical arm shot out and made a grab for the gold filling in the back tooth of a duchess who was standing nearby. There was an ugly scene, and the machine was smashed by the crowd. There was some lady, probably in a nice dress, right? Like a queen kind of lady, right? And the arm of this machine reached out and grabbed her tooth that was gold and tried to take it out of her mouth. And the crowd went crazy and smashed the machine. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspaper announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents in a great city far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture of the finder. She was sitting between her beaming father and mother in the living room of their house, waving the golden ticket above her head and grinning from ear to ear. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspapermen exactly how the ticket was found. You see, boys, he had said, as soon as my little girl told me that she simply had to have one of these golden tickets, I went out of the town and started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them. I must have bought hundreds and thousands. Then I had them loaded onto trucks and sent directly to my own factory. I'm in the peanut business, you see, and I've got about 100 women working for me over at my place, shelling peanuts for roasting and salting. That's what they do all day long, these women. They sit there shelling peanuts. So I say to them, okay, girls, I say, from now on, you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers off these chocolate bars instead. And they did. I had every worker in that place yanking the paper off those bars of that chocolate, full speed ahead from morning till night. But 3 days went by and we had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day. And every time I went home, she would scream at me, "Where's my golden ticket? I want my golden ticket." And she would lie for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling in the most disturbing way. Well, I just hated to see my little girl feeling unhappy like that, so I vowed I would keep up the search until I got her what she wanted. Then suddenly,
On the evening of the fourth day, one of my women workers yelled, "I've got it! A golden ticket!" And I said, "Give it to me, quick!" And she did. And I rushed it home and gave it to my darling Veruca, and now she's all smiles, and we have a happy home once again. That's even worse than the fat boy, said Grandma Josephine. She needs a really good spanking, said Grandma Georgina. I don't think that girl's father played it quite fair, Grandpa. Do you? Charlie murmured. He spoils her, Grandpa Joe said, and no good can come of spoiling a child like that. Charlie, you mark my words. Come to bed, my darling, said Charlie's mother. Tomorrow's your birthday, don't forget that, so I expect you'll be up early to open your present. A Wonka bar, isn't it? Cried Charlie. It's a Wonka bar, isn't it? Yes, my love, his mother said. Of course it is. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I found a third golden ticket inside it? Charlie said. Bring it in here when you get it, Grandpa Joe said. Then we can all watch you taking off the wrapper. Nice. Look at this. This is Veruca Salt, isn't it? That's her father. You can see what kind of guy he is. That's her mother. Look at these glasses. Nice. And so
chapter 7. Happy birthday! Cried the 4 old grandparents as Charlie came into their room early the next morning. Charlie smiled nervously and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his 2 hands. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight, it said on the wrapper. The 4 old people, 2 at either end of the bed, propped themselves up on their pillows and stared with anxious eyes at the bar of chocolate in Charlie's hands. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the foot of the bed watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Charlie looked down at the bar of chocolate. He ran his fingers slowly back and forth along the length of it, stroking it lovingly, and the shiny paper wrapper made little, sharp, crackly noises in the quiet room. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, "You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling, if you don't find what you're looking for underneath that wrapper. You really can't expect to be as lucky as all that." "She's quite right," Mr. Bucket said. Charlie didn't say anything. "After all," Grandma Josephine said, "in the whole wide world there are only 3 tickets left to be found." "The thing to remember," Grandma Georgina said, "is that whatever happens, you'll still have the bar of chocolate." "Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight," cried Grandpa George. "It's the best of them all. You'll just love it." "Yes," Charlie said. "I know. Just forget about all those golden tickets and enjoy that chocolate," Grandpa Joe said. "Why don't you do that?" They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little bar of chocolate to have a magic ticket inside it, and they were trying as gently and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But there was one other thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this, that however small the chance might be of striking lucky, the chance was there. The chance had to be there. This particular bar of chocolate had as much chance as any other of having a golden ticket, and that was why all the grandparents and parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. "You'd better go ahead and open it up, or you'll be late for school," Grandpa Joe said. "You might as well get it over with," Grandpa George said. "Open it, my dear," Grandma Georgina said. "Please open it. You're making me jumpy." Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, craning their scraggly necks. Then suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie tore the wrapper right down the middle, and on his lap there fell, was it a golden ticket? A light brown, creamy-colored bar of chocolate. No, there was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. "Well, that's that," said Grandpa Joe brightly. "It's just what we expected." Charlie looked up. 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, a small, sad smile, and then he shrugged his shoulders and picked up the chocolate bar and held it out to his mother and said, "Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it." "Certainly not," his mother said. And the others all cried, "No, no, we wouldn't dream of it. It's all yours." "Please," begged Charlie, turning round and offering it to Grandpa Joe. But neither he nor anyone else would take even a tiny bit. It's time to go to school, my darling, Mrs. Bucket said, putting an arm around Charlie's skinny shoulders. Come on, or you'll be late. What do you think of that? Sad, huh? Well, let's see. Look at this chapter. So now two tickets have been found, right? And there's 3 more tickets left. So this chapter, chapter 8, is called Two More Golden Tickets Found. So after this chapter will be only 1 more ticket left. Let's see what happens. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. 2 golden tickets found today, screamed the headlines. Only 1 more left. All right, said Grandpa Joe, when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. Let's hear who found them. The 3rd ticket, read Mr. Bucket, holding up the newspaper close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. The 3rd ticket was found by a Miss Violet Beauregard. There was great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing and people were pushing and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. And the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly at arm's length as though she were flagging a taxi. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that she had said, because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. That's what the newspaper said, huh? She's chewing gum so you can't hear. I'm a gum chewer normally, she said, but when I... Funny voice, huh? There she is. Is that her? Veruca Salt? Look at that. She's holding up her golden ticket. She's chewing gum. But when I heard about these ticket things of Mr. Wonka's, I gave up gum and started on chocolate bars in the hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm back on gum. I just adore gum. I can't do without it. I munch it all day long except for a few minutes at mealtimes when I take it out and stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have that little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not ladylike and it looks ugly to see a girl's jaws going up and down like mine do all the time, but I don't agree. And who's she to criticize anyway? Because if you ask me, I'd say her jaws are going up and down almost all as much as mine are, just from yelling at me every minute of the day. Now, Violet, Mrs. Beauregard said from a far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. All right, Mother, keep your hair on, Mrs. Beauregard shouted. And now, she said, turning to the reporters again, it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I've been chewing right at this moment is one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. She's been chewing the same gum for 3 months? That's a record, that is. It's beaten the record held by my best friend, Miss Cornelia Pritzmettle. And she was furious. It's my most treasured possession now, this piece of gum is. At night time, I just stick it on the end of a bedpost, and it's as good as ever in the mornings. A bit hard at first, maybe, but it soon softens up after I've given it a few good chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day. I used to do it in our lift on the way home from school. Why the lift? Because I like sticking the gooey piece that I just finished with onto one of the control buttons. Then the next person who came along and pressed the button got my old gum on the end of his finger. Ha ha! And what a racket they kicked up, some of them. You get the best results with women who have expensive gloves on. Oh, yes, I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Wonka's factory. And I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me for the rest of my whole life. Whoopee! Hooray! Beastly girl, said Grandma Josephine. Despicable, said Grandma Georgina. She'll come to a sticky end one day. Excuse me. Chewing all that gum, you see if she doesn't. And who got the 4th golden ticket? Charlie asked. Now, let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The 4th golden ticket, he read, was found by a boy called Mike TV. And look at that name. What does that sound like, TV? Sounds like TV, doesn't it? That's his name, Mike TV. What do you think Mike TV likes? I bet you can guess. TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed, like all the others, with excited visitors when our newspaper arrived, but young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. Can't you fools see I'm watching television? He said angrily. I wish you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one bunch of gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from belts around his body, and every now and again he would leap up into the air and fire off a half a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. 18 toy pistols? Man, quite a belt, huh? Quite, he shouted when someone Oh, quiet, he shouted when someone tried to ask him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the rotten ones, where there's no shooting. I like the gangsters best. They're terrific, these gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead or flashing the old stilettos or giving each other the 1, 2, 3 with their knuckle dusters. Gosh, what I wouldn't give to be doing that myself. It's the life. I tell you, it's terrific. That's quite enough, snapped Grandma Josephine. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. Do all children believe like this nowadays? Like these brats we've been hearing about? Of course not, said Mr. Bucket, smiling at the old lady in the bed. Some do, of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, sniffed Grandma Georgina. And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket'll go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. And that is the end of Chapter 8. All right, Chapter 9, Grandpa Joe Takes a Gamble. The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went in to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned at Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand. And when the hand came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in the fingers. Under cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver sixpence. What's a sixpence? It's a coin, I think, isn't it? It's my secret hoard, he whispered. The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding that last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me. Are you sure you want me to spend the money on that, Grandpa? Charlie whispered. Of course I'm sure, spluttered the old man excitedly. Don't stand there arguing. I'm as keen as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down the street to the nearest shop and buy the first Wonka bar you see and bring it straight back to me, and we'll open it together. Nice Grandpa, huh? Charlie took the little silver coin and slipped quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes, he was back. Have you got it? Whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out his bar of chocolate. Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise, it said on the wrapper. Good, said the old man, sitting up in bed and rubbing his hands. Now, come over here and sit close to me, and we'll open it together. Are you ready? Yes, Charlie said, I'm ready. All right, you tear off the first bit. No, Charlie said, you paid for it. You do it all. The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the wrapper. He's excited, isn't he? We don't have a hope, really, he whispered, giggling a bit. You do know that we don't have a hope, don't you? Yes, Charlie said, I know that. They looked at each other, and both started giggling nervously. Mind you, said Grandpa Joe, there is just that tiny chance that it might be the one. Don't you agree? Yes, Charlie said. Of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa? All in good time, my boy. All in good time. Which end do you think I ought to open first? That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything. Like that? Said the old man. Yes. Now a little bit more. You finish it, said Grandpa Joe. I'm too nervous. No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself. Very well, then. Here goes. He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of chocolate, nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter. "What on earth's going on?" cried Grandpa Josephine, waking up suddenly. "Nothing," said Grandpa Joe. "You go back to sleep." So there was no ticket. Well, too bad. Not a high chance, like Grandpa Joe said. All right, we're going to read one more chapter. Chapter 10, The Family Begins to Starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down out of the ice sky that was the color of steel. Do you see this word right here, color? In American English, it's spelled with no U. This word here, color. But in British English, there's a U. Isn't that interesting? By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was! Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious, warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Wow. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place that where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets, but it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day, as he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep swallowing breaths, as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy? He can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandpa Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I heard his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over his cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so as to save his strength. In the mornings, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school, without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during breaks, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a 50-pence piece. 50 pence is a lot of money for him. Quickly, he looked around him. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way that part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then was it his, this 50-cent piece? 50 pence? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50 pence! He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, and only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quickly to himself, he would buy one luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right there and then. And the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give it to his mother. And that is the end of that chapter.